Got another sweet story about psychedelics, and this one is both exciting as well as a little concerning. MDMA still win FDA approval. There's rally is in short. Veterans, lawmakers, and PTSD experts gathered to advocate for FDA approval of MDMA-assisted therapy and highlight the impact of PTSD and veteran suicide on July 10th in Washington, D.C. FDA is expected to decide this week whether to approve the drug for therapy. It's a crucial moment for the future of psychedelic medicine. August 11th, the Food and Drug Administration is expected to decide whether MDMA, chemical found in ecstasy or Molly, can be prescribed as a treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. Orders have launched an all-out push to convince the agency. FDA approval is far from certain, given that advisors to the agency overwhelmingly rejected the evidence supporting MDMA in combination with psychotherapy in June. Military veterans have emerged as some of the most visible advocates, arguing it fills a much-needed gap in effective treatments for PTSD. Rogers Mason, an Army veteran, was skeptical when his wife broached the idea. I blew it off, as that's a bunch of woo-woo, recalls Mason, who was 55 and suffered from PTSD for years after his military service. However, treatment rid him of chronic nightmares and dramatically turned down the volume on his other symptoms. He's even planning to travel to Washington, D.C. in the coming days to meet with lawmakers and lobby with other veterans. As of Friday, more than 60 House Democrats and Republicans had signed on to a letter organized by a veterans group calling for FDA approval, and another letter is making it right now. Downvote in June, not to mention the controversy about the trials that spilled into full view during a public hearing, has put the FDA in a tough spot. Eat its advisors' recommendations and deny approval? Greenlight the long-awaited decision on psychedelics? History suggests the odds are stacked against approval. Research shows FDA sides with its advisory committee in most circumstances. The agency does deviate, it's usually in favor of taking a more cautious approach. Hardly ever do they go against a negative vote, says Dr. Aaron Kesselheim, a professor at Harvard Medical School who specializes in FDA law. However, the FDA isn't immune to public pressure. There are times when the agency has moved ahead in spite of its advisors, particularly when patients mounted an aggressive advocacy campaign. Call and write your senators. FDA doesn't operate in a vacuum. The staff read the same newspapers that you and I read, he said. The agency has a range of options here. Lycos would be required to submit additional data or even run a new clinical trial. Alternatively, approval could come with a requirement to do post-market research, plus tight restrictions on how the drug is administered. It's hard for me to speculate, said Lycos' Emerson, but there is no stopping the work on this. We put decades of time and resources into doing this research. Still, most in the field believe that approval for MDMA is not so much a matter of if, but when. Treatment was granted breakthrough status, and FDA staff signed off on the trial design, although it became clear during the advisory meeting that certain recommendations were not followed. I think that's important to pay attention to. Dr. George Greer, who signed a letter with DeWitt and a handful of other researchers, was surprised by the unfavorable reception and remains confident the drug will have its day. Benefits of MDMA for people with severe PTSD is virtually overwhelming, said Greer, president of the Hefter Research Institute. Greer takes a long view, having used MDMA in therapy since the 80s in his own private practice. It blocks the emotional fear response to a perceived threat, says Greer. It also provides the emotional energy to face those horrible trauma memories and balance with them. Leanna Mercer, a Marine Corps veteran and director of veteran advocacy and public policy for Healing Breakthrough, speaks on July 10th at the Capitol in Washington, D.C., along with other members of Congress and other veterans. The argument many U.S. veterans make in their lobbying for MDMA is that it works to heal the mental wounds of service, and other drugs like antidepressants don't. Earlier this year, a top doctor at the VA signaled his support for the treatment, which his agency plans to study for mental health along with other psychedelic compounds, separate track from the. These veterans have been suffering and they've not been cared for, says Jesse Gould, a former Army Ranger who heads the nonprofit Heroic Hearts Project. These veterans do not have the 5 years to wait for another FDA trial, he said. Now, on the downside, many scientists are concerned about the scientific rigor of Lycos' research and the serious allegations about misconduct and bias. During the June hearing, the FDA advisors raised a series of objections. Participants were not adequately blinded, meaning they could tell whether or not they had received the drug. That one's hard to deal with. There were also concerns about missing data and lack of evidence supporting the therapy protocol, to name it. The real wild card in the decision is the ethical controversy over how Lycos ran its trials. There's a well-documented instance of therapists having inappropriate physical contact with a patient while she was under MDMA in the phase 2 trials. That really hurts my heart. Another participant in the phase 3 trials has described her own experience of worsening symptoms, suicidality, and being inappropriately influenced by her therapist. These issues and others were raised in a report from the Institute that evaluates clinical research and in a petition to the FDA calling for a public hearing because of allegations that bias influenced the results and some patients experienced adverse events that were not reported. Form of therapy used in MDMA sessions, which is developed by MAPS, has faced criticism that it can lead to abuse of power when patients are under the influence and vulnerable to suggestion. We cannot just use this sense of urgency to push forward a harmful model which would ultimately backfire, says Nenis Devino, a senior lecturer in writing at Johns Hopkins who studies and advocates for psychedelics. Though MDMA goes hand in hand with psychotherapy, the agency doesn't actually regulate that component, the psychotherapy. Ultimately, there's no way to require that the therapeutic approach even be used when treating patients. Most people think a harm reduction approach where you have an approved medication that people can get administered under medical supervision would be the best form of treatment moving forward. Lastly, Roger Mason says, this is not a magic pill, still a lot of self-work that has to go into it. And I think that highlights the real importance of psychedelics right there, that last. Oh, there's a mixed bag. The FDA could end up approving this medicine if there is enough public speaking on it. Really, a lot of the issues highlighted by Lykos's poor handling of this should be highlighted. As we move forward with cannabis and psychedelics, we are going to always be under increased scrutiny because of the cultural backlash of these substances and all of the decades of negative messaging. And so I think it's very important that every company slows down on their rush to the patent medicine or the approval in order to make money and really treads incredibly lightly so that we can get great science done and continue to assemble this scientific canon of great studies that show a tremendous amount of efficacy, real rigorous studies. I'm interested to hear what you, Jason and Jenny, have to add or any questions you might have about this story.
You want to go first, Jenny?
I mean, I'm just still stuck on the fact, once again, here's proof of what happens when we have the wrong people administering plant medicine. It breaks my heart that somebody was taken advantage of because they were trying to go get treatment with an alternative, medication. So, I just think that, when I was 19, I got into a whole relationship over, how comfortable you are with somebody on MDMA when you shouldn't be. It's easy to take people down the wrong trail. And I think that it's disgusting that someone who is a medical doctor who signed an oath to protect and care for people is willing to do something like that. And I think it's really shitty that it stands in the way of the good that the medicine can do for people.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. The doctor sounds like a super creepo. That's for sure.
And the other thing that, of course, St. Germain is going to harp on is that if we look at this story, we see evidence of multiple, and this is only a few named groups. There's so many more, multiple groups that are dealing with veterans and PTSD and substance abuse and mental health issues. Mm-hmm. And again, if we as a group, as a polity, American citizens would stop requiring our service members to go to other people's countries in order to either try to police their political systems and or secure their resources for our eventual theft or abuse, we wouldn't have this huge amount, hundreds of thousands of service members living with trauma, nightmares, substance abuse, and mental health issues. And I continue to say the black magic perpetrated on the American public, 9/11 attacks, still shocks me to this day. Even the majority of people who will look at and admit that there is something wrong with what happened to Building 7, as well as the rest of these attacks, seems to be some sort of collusion between U.S. intelligence agencies, the forces that perpetrated these attacks, will still be yelling, support our troops as they go forward into other people's countries for completely pointless wars. Mm-hmm. To, again, secure other people's resources instead of allowing them the freedom to determine their own course in the world. And if we just stop doing the bad thing in the first place, we can use psychedelics more as something to accelerate our evolutionary potential instead of just bandaging our damaged psyches.
Mm-hmm. Fair points. You know, I just wonder, Mathieu St. Germain, because I feel like this MDMA would get through a federal process much faster than cannabis, mainly for the simple point that it's something that can be duplicated in the same way over and over again, unlike
it's a single molecule therapy.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it already was, right? Wasn't it used in like marriage and relationship counseling so that, you could be lovey enough to discuss all these things about how your husband pissed you off last week?
It has been, and there's actually a couple of different, or at least one really well-known underground association of psychotherapists in California that has been using MDMA in an unbroken chain since the 60s. Mm-hmm. They were not everyone is a great success, but they do report wild success for most people. Mm-hmm. My wife and I use it. Sometimes we'll just do a little MDA or MDMA by ourselves at the house when the kids are gone, and it does help you to reconnect and to discuss issues in your own self, or your relationship with yourself, your relationship with your partner, in a way where people aren't taking it personal, retrenching into their sides and trying to defend, where everybody's really sharing and open to that sharing, willing to move towards a center and to get along. And I think it's a real reason for why our relationship still feels so vital and young and successful, even though we've been together over 20 years.
Fair enough.
Which is amazing.
Much.
But again, I think the real important thing is what that gentleman who had PTSD, that veteran, said at the end, which is, this is a tool, and it's the self work that really makes it workable. Like MDMA and all of these things, and like you said, Jenny, like you could take MDMA and think you're in love with somebody, but if that person you think you're in love with is a predator or not willing to do that self work, you could find yourself in a horrible relationship for years. And I also have seen that happen, and we've seen that happen back in the day with Charles Manson, who was trained by Louis Jolyon West of MK Ultra, taught him how to use LSD to take advantage of the youth that were flooding into the hate, and to create a cult of people that were willing to break the law and harm other people, for him representing himself as a prophet or a god man. Mm-hmm. There's a high potential for abuse with all of these substances, and that's why when we go back to the indigenous traditions, there's such a rigor in the indigenous traditions of who is allowed to use these, how they are allowed to use these, and kind of how they are shepherded through that system to try to prevent the rise of sorcerers. And sorcerers are people who use magic for their ego and their power, whereas the curanderismo or the healers are the people who use these plant and fungal magics to help their tribe. And
what did you call them, Mathieu St. Germain?
Sorcerers?
No,
those are like Darth Vader.
Uh-huh.
And then the healers or the curanderismo are like Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Curanderismo, huh?
Curanderismo, it's a South American term for people who use plants to heal people.
Got it. Thank you so much for that.